In the heart of the rugged Oregon Cascades, two adventurous teenage girls, Jansen and Quinn Walsh, set off on what was supposed to be a 3-day backpacking trip, one that would mark their love for the wilderness and their independence. But by Thursday morning, August 16, 2014, their parents' anxious waiting would turn to terror. The girls had promised to call to check in with their satellite messenger, but the call never came. What followed was every parent's nightmare. Despite their extensive experience in the wild and a carefully planned route, the girls disappeared without a trace, leaving only an untouched campsite behind. A campsite so eerily pristine it made no sense. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of danger, nothing that explained why two seasoned hikers would suddenly vanish into thin air. For 4 years, the only trace of Iris and Quinn was a single ping from their satellite device, showing their last known location, but there was nothing beyond that. No answers. No closure. Until, in 2018, a seasoned hunter, far from any trail, uncovered a chilling discovery deep in the forest that would shatter everything anyone thought they knew about their disappearance. It wasn't just a bone. It was evidence of a horrifying truth. The girls didn't just get lost. They didn't just fall victim to the wilderness. Something far darker lurked in the shadows of the Cascades. The search for two missing teens would soon uncover a truth so disturbing, it would leave the wilderness and the families who waited for so long forever changed. We want to take a moment to sincerely thank every single one of you for watching. Your support means the world to us. If you're enjoying our content, please consider subscribing to our channel. We put so much effort into creating these stories, and your subscription helps us keep going. For those of you who haven't subscribed yet, what's holding you back? We'd love to know in the comments section below. Your feedback is incredibly valuable to us, and it helps us improve. And if you're one of the many viewers who haven't yet clicked that subscribe button, please let us know where you're watching from. We're always curious to see where our audience is tuning in from. Don't forget to drop a comment. We read every single one. Let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for being here. The evening of Wednesday, August 15, 2014, should have been a routine check-in. Lena Petrovich, a mother who knew the risks of the wilderness well, had already spent countless hours preparing her daughter Iris Jansen and her best friend, Quinn Walsh, for this very trip. These were seasoned hikers after all. Their planned 3-day backpacking trip in the Oregon Cascades had all the elements of an unforgettable adventure. But this time something was different. This time the check-in didn't come. For Lena, a familiar routine became the start of a growing unease. It wasn't like her daughter to break a promise, especially when it involved something as simple as a phone call. At first, it felt like nothing more than a minor delay, the kind that happens when a phone dies or service gets spotty in the backcountry. 8 p.m. passed. Then 9:00 p.m. By now, Lena's concern was starting to shift from casual to urgent. She picked up the phone again, dialing both girls' numbers, hoping for that cheerful voice on the other end, ready to share the details of their hike. But instead she was met with a cold, robotic voicemail. No answer. Just silence. Lena tried to reassure herself. This wasn't uncommon in the wilderness. The cell service in the Cascades was notoriously patchy, especially in more remote areas. She tried to wait it out, but with every ring that went unanswered, anxiety built in her chest. By midnight something shifted. That reassuring calm she'd felt earlier in the evening vanished. She paced the house, dialed again and then again. Each call went straight to voicemail. Not a single word from her daughter, the girl she knew so well. Where was Iris? At this point, Lena was panicking, and there was no hiding it. Her fingers trembled as she clicked open the satellite messenger app, a device she had insisted the girls take for safety. The small gadget, designed to send emergency signals, track movement, and allow check-ins, was supposed to provide peace of mind. But the screen in front of her didn't provide reassurance, it provided more silence. The satellite device hadn't updated since Monday, August 13th, 3 days ago. There was nothing since then. No check-in. No movement. No SOS signal. The coordinates showed a single spot, the location of their first campsite. The girls were supposed to be far from that spot now. By Wednesday evening, they should have been near their second campsite, with plenty of time to call home and share their progress. But here it was, the last known location frozen in time. They hadn't moved since Monday morning. What had happened in those 48 hours? The digital map was eerily still, a stark contrast to the lively, energetic teens Lena had spoken to just days ago. Her mind raced, but she couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. Had they gone off trail? Had something happened to them? A wild animal, an accident? It seemed impossible. They were prepared. They were experienced. They knew the risks. They had everything they needed. But here in front of her was no explanation. Lena sat at the computer staring at the screen. The campsite that the girls had set up was not far from a small creek. A clearing in the woods, perfect for experienced backpackers to camp. But now it was empty. Not a single sign of trouble. There were no footprints leading away from the campsite. No tracks in the soil, no sign that the girls had packed up in a hurry. No blood, no sign of struggle. Everything was left behind. Their sleeping bags, their packs, and the satellite messenger still powered on and blinking, almost as if waiting for someone to pick it up and use it. Yet there were no signs of them at all. It was as if they had disappeared into thin air, leaving only their belongings behind. The silence around their disappearance was unnerving. The lack of clues made Lena's mind run wild with questions. Could they have gotten lost? Were they just out of range? Could something dangerous have happened? And then the most chilling possibility dawned on her. What if they weren't just lost? What if something more sinister was at play? Lena's mind raced in 1,000 directions. She knew she couldn't just sit there and wait. The situation was spiraling out of control. It was no longer a simple delay. Her daughter and Quinn were missing. Something was wrong, and she couldn't let the fear of the unknown hold her back any longer. She had to take action. The clock was ticking, and every minute that passed could mean the difference between life and death. As the search and rescue teams descended into the Oregon Cascades, the harsh terrain and thick trees seemed to close in around them, amplifying the feeling of isolation. Every step taken, every branch pushed aside, led them deeper into a mystery that no one could have anticipated. But then they reached the campsite, the exact location shown on the satellite messenger's last ping. What they found there was nothing short of chilling. An abandoned campsite that looked as though the girls had simply vanished, as if they'd never been there. The campsite itself was eerily perfect, almost too perfect given the circumstances. It was a small clearing nestled beside a babbling creek, with a perfect view of the towering pines surrounding it. The scene looked like it could have been plucked straight out of a hiker's guidebook, made for a restful night in the wilderness. But the normalcy of the scene stood in stark contrast to the absence of the girls. The blue backpacks, those same backpacks that had been in the family photo Lena had provided, were resting against a log, packed and ready for the next leg of the journey, yet no one was there to pick them up. The backpacks were arranged neatly, as if the girls had gone off for a short walk or hike and would be returning at any moment. The familiar sight of those backpacks, seen in the photo just days earlier, sent a sharp pang through the chest of the searchers. But as they moved closer, the perfectly untouched scene began to feel more and more unnatural. Nothing was out of place. The girls' sleeping bags rolled neatly inside their tent. Their food supplies still intact, untouched, stored in bear-proof containers as if they had followed every wilderness safety rule. Even their headlamps and water filtration systems were set up precisely where they should have been. It looked like they had planned to return to the site, to settle in for the night. But they never did. The fire pit lay cold, not a single ember left, despite the fact the girls were supposed to have been there for days. The stillness of the scene was unbearable, no signs of disturbance, no footprints leading away from the camp, no scattered gear, nothing. There was no sign that the girls had even moved from their site, no traces of a hasty retreat or any indication that something had gone wrong. No blood, no torn clothing, no broken gear. The surrounding area didn't even appear to have been disturbed by animals, a telltale sign that would have indicated a struggle. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was the satellite messenger. The small device that had been a symbol of safety for the parents was now resting on a stone near the fire pit, its blinking light signaling that it was still working, still powered on. But when the rescue teams checked the device, they found it hadn't been moved in over 48 hours. 48 hours. That wasn't just a clue, it was an ominous one. The device was supposed to be a lifeline, an emergency beacon in case something went wrong, but it hadn't sent out an SOS signal. It hadn't updated its location. It hadn't even been activated. The last ping was from Monday, August 13th, when the girls should have been heading back towards their car. The silence from the device was the loudest thing about the scene. And that's where the mystery deepened. How could two experienced hikers who knew the risks of the wilderness leave their camp, their food, supplies, satellite device, and backpacks completely untouched without a single sign of trouble? What would have caused them to leave all of this behind? Had they found something? Had they stumbled upon a danger that made them run for their lives? Or worse, had something happened to them? What could make two young, capable hikers abandon their campsite in such an orderly manner, as though they were going to return at any moment, but never came back? Was there a third party involved, something sinister lurking in the forest? The questions spiraled, each one darker than the last. Each new discovery added another layer to the unsettling enigma of their disappearance. And the unanswered question remained, chillingly unresolved. What happened to Iris and Quinn? When Iris Jansen and Quinn Walsh went missing, the wilderness of the Oregon Cascades quickly became the center of an urgent, intense search. What had started as a mother's worry quickly evolved into something far more desperate, a coordinated search effort that involved state-of-the-art technology, expert teams, and a relentless drive to bring the girls home. But as the search and rescue operation ramped up, the landscape became more baffling and unforgiving with every passing hour. Helicopters sliced through the early morning fog, their engines roaring as they hovered over the dense forest, scouring the treetops for any signs of life. Ground crews, a mix of seasoned hikers and local volunteers, trekked through rugged terrain, clambering over rocks, wading through fast-moving streams, and trudging through thick underbrush. Canine units sniffed the air, their trained noses desperately trying to pick up the scent of the missing girls. Even aerial support was called in, with drones capturing the vastness of the search area, scanning vast miles of wilderness for any clue that could break the case open. Yet, despite the sheer magnitude of the operation, nothing, absolutely nothing surfaced. The area they had to cover was enormous, stretching across thousands of miles of mountainous terrain, thick forests, steep ravines, and isolated valleys. And still, no sign of Iris or Quinn emerged. The forest, once so alive with the promise of adventure, felt eerily silent. Lena Petrovich, Iris's mother, was a constant presence at the search command center, where a large map covered one entire wall. She stared at it relentlessly, her eyes tracing over the marked routes, trying to hold on to the smallest sliver of hope. With every new search team deployed, she would push for more, suggesting new areas they could explore, questioning whether they had missed something, anything that could explain the girls' disappearance. Her eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, but her determination was unwavering. Every new update on the search only heightened her sense of helplessness. Every new hour without progress felt like a lifetime. The team had gone over every detail. The satellite messenger, the girls' last known coordinates, the path they had taken, everything pointed to a site just half a mile off the trail. Yet nothing had been found. No tracks, no dropped items, no signs of a struggle. The silence was suffocating. Lena's mind spun. She couldn't help but wonder, had they wandered off the trail? Or worse, had something else caused them to vanish? Her motherly instincts gnawed at her, but she kept her composure, demanding answers from the search and rescue officers and pushing for more resources, more personnel to be brought in. But as the hours turned into days, the frustration grew on everyone's face in every conversation. The entire region seemed to be a vast, empty wilderness, and yet it had swallowed up her daughter and Quinn without a trace. There were no signs. No disturbance in the campsite. No call for help from the satellite messenger. The search teams were exhausted. The forests were dense, and the area they had to comb felt endless. A new update on the satellite device would have been a glimmer of hope, a digital breadcrumb that could help them track the girls. But the device remained dead. No updates, no SOS signals, and no communication. The failure to find anything, no clues, no signs, no trace of the girls was like a heavy weight pressing on the shoulders of everyone involved. And for Lena, each passing hour without any new development was a new blow. Her mind raced with impossible questions. Had they left the campsite willingly? Had they been forced to leave by something they encountered? What if someone else was involved? In the command center, maps were covered in red marks indicating the routes already searched. The data, GPS coordinates, satellite pings, and aerial imagery had all been checked, double-checked, and cross-checked. But there were still no answers. No trace of her daughter. No trace of Quinn. It became clear something was wrong. And the more the team searched, the more questions arose. The frustration mounted as the hours stretched into days, and the search grew increasingly desperate. As the days wore on, hope began to flicker. The longer the girls were missing, the more Lena feared the worst. Were they lost? Were they injured? Or had something happened that no one could explain? The tension was palpable. No clues were being uncovered. No new leads to follow. Just more silence. The search had been going on for days now, and every piece of new information seemed to lead only to more dead ends. But just as the search teams were starting to feel the weight of despair, something curious was uncovered, something that might give them a new angle to investigate. It wasn't a map. It wasn't a note. It was a seemingly ordinary object that didn't fit with the survival gear the girls were known to carry. An alpine flora guidebook. Found inside the girls' tent, nestled among their neatly packed belongings, this was no ordinary hiking book. It wasn't a wilderness survival guide or a book on local wildlife. This was an academic text, a specialized guide focusing solely on rare plants that bloomed only at high elevations in the Oregon Cascades. At first, this seemed insignificant, perhaps just another piece of random camping gear. But the more the authorities examined it, the more they realized it might hold the key to understanding what had happened to Iris and Quinn. Why would two experienced hikers bring such an academic and non-essential guidebook with them on a trip that was supposed to be a routine hike? The more investigators thought about it, the more they began to question the possibility that the girls had planned something beyond just a campsite stay. Could they have been looking for something specific? The guidebook was filled with pages dedicated to rare wildflowers, plants that only bloomed during late summer and could only be found at higher elevations, specifically near the ridge line that overlooked the valley where the campsite was located. The more investigators studied the book, the more a theory began to take shape. Could it be that Iris and Quinn had planned to leave their campsite and take a short foraging trip? Perhaps they had intended to venture a short distance into the mountainside to explore the ridges for these rare wildflowers. The guidebook might explain why they left their heavy gear behind. Maybe they intended to return quickly, just as any experienced hiker would when heading out to explore a nearby ridge. But then the mystery deepened. The search efforts had already scoured the ridges, the areas where they suspected the girls might have gone. The helicopters had flown low over the same terrain the girls might have explored, and the ground teams had trekked through the dense forest around the area, looking for clues, anything that would lead them to the girls. Nothing had been found. The guidebook gave investigators hope, but hope alone wasn't enough. Why didn't the girls return? The lead seemed promising, but it couldn't answer the most critical question. If they had gone to explore the ridges, why had they not come back to the campsite? Why leave behind all their supplies, including the satellite messenger, which could have helped them if they'd encountered trouble? What happened to them after they left the camp? Despite the new lead, despite the possibility that they had ventured out for the wildflowers, the search teams were left perplexed. Nothing added up. The more they looked at the guidebook, the more it raised questions instead of answering them. For Lena Petrovich, the discovery was a glimmer of hope, but only a fleeting one. It didn't answer the heart-wrenching question: where were Iris and Quinn? The guidebook might explain their possible intentions, but it couldn't explain their disappearance. As the days dragged on, that flicker of hope began to fade. It wasn't the breakthrough they needed, and Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something darker might be at play, something far beyond just an innocent hike in search of wildflowers. But the discovery of the guidebook did reveal one important thing: it gave the investigation a new theory. The girls' plans might have been spontaneous, but the risk they had taken was not like their usual adventures. What had happened? Was the guidebook simply a clue to something they never came back from? Or was it evidence of something far more sinister? The more they tried to piece together the details, the more the search teams found themselves on the edge of a dangerous unknown, one they couldn't quite explain. The guidebook only deepened the mystery, leaving more questions in its wake. The search for Iris Jansen and Quinn Walsh had been exhaustive, relentless, and all-encompassing. In the first few weeks, search teams combed through the dense forests, trekked across steep ravines, and even scanned miles of rugged terrain from the air. But after days, weeks, and eventually months, the once promising leads began to feel like fading memories. The silence that enveloped the wilderness was growing louder. With no new evidence, no fresh leads, and nothing but empty wilderness to search, the case of the missing hikers began to slip into the shadows. For the families, the brutal truth was starting to settle in. The more they searched, the less they found. The lack of answers was a constant ache, a dull, unrelenting throb in the pit of their stomachs. But for Lena Petrovich, giving up was never an option. She had raised Iris with the kind of strength only a mother could understand. No amount of silence, no lack of progress, would stop her from doing everything she could to bring her daughter and Quinn home. She kept pushing, kept fighting. While the official search slowed down, Lena refused to let the case slip into the archives of cold, forgotten cases. She organized private searches of her own, hiring expert trackers who could spot a hidden trail where others saw only dense trees. She would arrive at remote locations with maps in hand, determined to cover any ground that might have been missed. Every piece of new information, no matter how small, was her lifeline, the only thing keeping her moving forward. Yet, with each new failed attempt, each day without answers, a bitter reality set in. Despite all of her efforts, despite the endless hours spent searching the vast Oregon Cascades, despite the countless private expeditions, it felt like she was chasing something that was slipping farther and farther away. And the world was moving on. As the weeks stretched into months, the case became a local ghost story. News coverage slowly waned, and what was once a nationwide search turned into nothing more than a tragic cautionary tale shared in hushed tones among hikers and locals. It became a faded memory, a chapter of the past that people stopped asking about. The painful reality was that, for most, the girls had become just another unexplained disappearance, a mystery that would never be solved. As each month passed without a single clue, the families felt the emotional toll of carrying the weight of this unresolved tragedy, knowing that without any new evidence, no answers would ever come. But for Lena, the slip into silence was something she couldn't accept. She couldn't move on. Iris was her daughter, and Quinn was like a second daughter. The need for closure, for truth, was too much to bear. She had to keep searching, no matter how impossible it seemed. And just when it seemed like the world was forgetting about the two young women who had vanished without a trace, fate stepped in. In 2018, 4 years after the girls had gone missing, the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for came, but it didn't come from the authorities. It came from an unexpected source, a local hunter named Haskell Bower. Haskell, a seasoned hunter in his late 50s, had spent decades navigating the rugged Oregon Cascades. He knew the terrain like the back of his hand. And one crisp morning, while tracking elk deep in a remote section of the forest, Haskell made a discovery that would change everything. What he found buried under the roots of a fallen tree would send a shockwave through the investigation. A bone, weathered and stained by time, but unmistakable. As he approached, his trained eyes quickly realized that this wasn't an animal bone. This was something far more chilling. It was human remains. Haskell's heart sank as he examined the find. It wasn't just a bone. It was a pelvis, and lodged in it was an object that made his blood run cold, an arrowhead. A rusted, crude weapon, unlike anything he had ever seen used in modern times. The discovery was more than just grisly, it was a breakthrough, the first real clue in years. Haskell immediately contacted the authorities, and soon forensic teams descended on the site. What they uncovered confirmed that the remains were, in fact, human, and they belonged to one of the missing girls. This discovery, buried deep in the wilderness for 4 years, set the investigation on a new path. But it also raised even more questions. What had happened to Iris and Quinn? How had they ended up in such a remote part of the forest? And more terrifyingly, what did this discovery reveal about the danger lurking in the Cascades? The families, who had felt the weight of time pressing down on them, now had something they could finally cling to, a new lead, something to hold on to in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. But the real mystery was just beginning. The discovery of the remains wasn't the end, it was the beginning of an even darker, more twisted story that would ultimately bring the families face to face with a truth they never saw coming. Thank you so much for staying with us through this journey. We know it's not easy, but your support means everything. If you're enjoying the story and want to see how it all unfolds, make sure to hit that like button. If you haven't already, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the rest of this mystery. We have so much more to reveal, and we want you to be a part of the journey. And if you're enjoying the suspense, leave us a comment below. We love hearing your thoughts and theories on what could have happened to Iris and Quinn. Stay tuned because the twists are just getting started. It had been 4 years since Iris Jansen and Quinn Walsh vanished without a trace into the heart of the Oregon Cascades. The search efforts had grown less intense, the case slipping into the shadows of forgotten mysteries. But then, deep in the heart of the forest, in a remote section of the Cascades that no one had thought to search, something happened. A discovery so chilling it would turn the entire investigation upside down. It was an ordinary morning when Haskell Bower, a local hunter with decades of experience navigating the rugged wilderness, set out on his usual hunt for elk. He knew these woods like the back of his hand, every trail, every tree, every creek. But on this particular day, deep in a section of the forest that was far removed from the search grid, Haskell made a discovery that no one could have ever predicted. There, under the twisted roots of a fallen tree, Haskell saw something that made his stomach drop. At first, he thought it was just another animal carcass, perhaps a deer or some other wildlife. But as he approached, he realized this wasn't just any animal, this was human remains. His heart raced as he examined the bones scattered around the disturbed earth. They were weathered, aged by time, but unmistakable. It was clear that these weren't the remains of someone who had died recently. This was something from the past, buried and forgotten for years. But the discovery wasn't just about the bones. As Haskell moved closer, he noticed something ominous lodged in the pelvis bone, something that sent a chill down his spine. It was a rusted arrowhead, old and corroded, unlike any modern weapon. Its jagged edges and crude design suggested an archaic weapon, one that seemed out of place in the 21st century. Haskell's mind raced. He had lived in these mountains his whole life, and the significance of what he was looking at was impossible to ignore. This wasn't a simple death. This wasn't a hiker who had gotten lost. The presence of the arrowhead indicated a violent death, one that seemed intentional, not accidental. Haskell knew what he had to do. He didn't hesitate. He immediately contacted the authorities, his voice thick with urgency. The discovery of human remains, combined with the archaic weapon, was not something to be taken lightly. Something terrible had happened here, and this was the breakthrough that the investigation had desperately needed. When forensic experts arrived and began examining the remains, the news that followed sent shockwaves through the investigation team. The remains were confirmed to be human, but the most chilling part was what they revealed about the cause of death. Forensic pathologists quickly deduced that the injuries caused by the rusted arrowhead pointed to a violent confrontation, not a natural death. The discovery of the arrowhead, primitive in nature, seemingly out of place in modern times, suggested that whoever had used it was familiar with old weapons, someone with knowledge of survival skills that went beyond the usual. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a message, a deliberate choice to use something so archaic, something so personal. For the investigators, this was a turning point. What had initially seemed like a missing person case, perhaps one where the girls had simply gotten lost or run into an unfortunate accident, was now something far more sinister. The girls hadn't just disappeared. They hadn't wandered off into the wilderness never to return. No. They had been the victims of something dark, something violent. The forensic team immediately reignited the investigation, focusing on this new lead: the bones, the arrowhead, and the questions they raised about what had really happened to Iris and Quinn. This discovery gave the case a new direction, a new urgency. The search for answers was now personal, not just a search for missing girls but a search for a killer. The question shifted: who had done this? And why? But as the investigators pieced together the fragments of the case, one thing became abundantly clear. This was no longer just a missing persons case. It was a homicide. And the question of how Iris and Quinn had ended up in that remote part of the forest, so far off the grid, was only the beginning of an even darker mystery. The discovery, made by a man who had been hunting for elk, would soon pull everyone involved into a web of secrets, lies, and hidden dangers. The Oregon Cascades, once seen as a beautiful wilderness, now felt like a place of death, a place that concealed the truth that no one was ready to face. This was just the start of an investigation that would take a shocking turn, one that would leave everyone questioning just how much darkness could hide in such an idyllic landscape. With the discovery of the remains and the archaic arrowhead, the case that once seemed like a tragic mystery now took a darker turn. It was clear. Iris Jansen and Quinn Walsh hadn't simply wandered off the trail, they had been targeted. This wasn't a random accident, and the rusted arrowhead found embedded in Quinn's pelvis was a message. The weapon wasn't just old, it was primitive, designed with intent. Forensic experts quickly identified it as something handmade, a piece of weaponry crafted by someone with knowledge of ancient tools. The arrowhead's design wasn't from modern times. No, it came from a different world, a world where survival skills and anti-modern sentiment went hand in hand. And that's when investigators began tracing its origins. The arrowhead's distinctive markings and style pointed to something bizarre. A local survivalist group known to craft their own primitive weapons. This group, living on the fringes of society, was notorious for practicing primitive hunting techniques and having a strong distrust of authority. They were seen by some as eccentric, but to others they were dangerous. They were the kind of people who preferred living off the grid, keeping to their own rules and eschewing modern technology. The survivalist group had been a quiet presence in the Oregon Cascades for years, but now, with the discovery of the arrowhead, the investigators were forced to take a much closer look. As they dug deeper, they uncovered a chilling connection. One of the members of the group, Orson Holloway, was tied to the area and had a history of anti-government sentiment. Orson Holloway was in his late 60s, a rugged man with a hard, weathered face. He had spent years living in the remote forests of Oregon, teaching younger generations how to survive off the land. He was a skilled tracker, a master of making his own weapons, and someone who had always been known to reject the government. In fact, Holloway was a vocal critic of park authorities, particularly the National Park Service, and had been involved in several heated confrontations with them over the years. No strangers to conflict, the group often clashed with local law enforcement, giving them the reputation of being rebellious and uncompromising. It didn't take long for Holloway to emerge as a suspect. He had the skills, the knowledge, and the right resources to craft a weapon like the one found in Quinn's body. But there was more. As investigators looked closer into Holloway's background, they found something unsettling. His anti-government views weren't just about self-sufficiency. They were rooted in a deep-seated belief that the government and law enforcement had no right to control the land, to invade the wilderness that he and his group held so dear. This painted a disturbing picture. What if Iris and Quinn, two experienced hikers, had stumbled upon something they shouldn't have? Had they wandered into territory controlled by Holloway's group, or worse, had they angered someone with their presence in the wilderness? But just as the investigation seemed to be zeroing in on Holloway, another unsettling possibility emerged. Kendrick Dillard, a respected park ranger who had been one of the first responders to the missing persons case, also came under scrutiny. Dillard had access to similar weapons, a fact that had slipped under the radar during the initial investigation. As a park ranger, he had access to equipment, tools, and resources that could make him a prime suspect. The investigation into Dillard was even more perplexing because of his role in the search efforts. He had been there, actively participating in the search for the missing girls, all while the investigation began to tighten around him. What made Dillard's involvement even more suspicious was his impeccable reputation. He was a well-respected figure in the local community, known for his dedication to his job. He was trusted, reliable, and appeared to have no history of violence, so why did the investigators now feel a growing sense of unease around him? As they dug deeper, a disturbing theory began to form. Dillard had been part of the team that searched the very area where the girls were last seen. Was it possible that he had known exactly where to look? Or, more disturbingly, that he was involved in their disappearance from the very beginning? The connection between Holloway and Dillard seemed to be growing stronger with every passing day. Both men had ties to the wilderness. Both had access to primitive weapons. And both had questionable ties to law enforcement and park authorities. But despite the growing suspicion, the investigation still lacked concrete evidence to prove the connection. The trail to Holloway grew hotter, as investigators discovered more about his group's lifestyle, his knowledge of the land, and his possible motive. But just as the pieces seemed to be falling into place, they hit a dead end. No hard evidence linked Orson Holloway directly to the crime, and while the similarities between the weapon found at the scene and those crafted by Holloway's group were striking, it was still circumstantial. As for Dillard, he remained an enigma. The investigation couldn't find any direct proof connecting him to the crime, and yet the feeling that something was deeply wrong lingered. The more they looked, the more the investigation stumbled. The answers were just out of reach. And with every new twist, the question kept growing more urgent. Who had murdered Quinn and Iris? Was it Holloway's group? Was it Dillard, the seemingly trustworthy park ranger? Or was there someone else hiding in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered? The search for Iris Jansen and Quinn Walsh had been long and grueling. For years, the case seemed to slip into the shadows, an unsolved mystery with no closure, no answers, just empty wilderness where two young lives had vanished. But everything changed in 2018, when a chilling discovery was made deep on Kendrick Dillard's property, a discovery that would unravel everything everyone thought they knew. The hidden cellar was found by a team of investigators, led by detectives who had long suspected Dillard's involvement but had no hard evidence to tie him to the crime. The cellar wasn't just a place to store tools or supplies, it was a trap, a prison that had concealed the horror of what had happened to Iris. Located in the remote woods near Dillard's cabin, the cellar was an isolated, hidden structure. It was cleverly constructed, blending in with the surrounding terrain. No one would have ever found it unless they were specifically looking. And looking they were. Detective Reese Garrison, the lead investigator, had always felt that something was off about Dillard, but the discovery of the cellar made that gut feeling a terrifying reality. Inside the cellar, they found evidence that Iris Jansen had been held captive for years, long after Quinn's murder. The reality was nothing short of horrifying. Forensic findings quickly confirmed that the remains found just outside the cellar were indeed Iris's. The bones were fragile, showing signs of prolonged captivity, the weight of years of abuse visible in every detail. The damage to her remains suggested that she had been subjected to unspeakable torture, held in a cold, dark place with no escape. The signs of malnutrition were clear, and the lack of care had taken a brutal toll on her body. But what truly shocked the investigators was the realization that Iris had been alive, trapped, and suffering for 4 years after the world had stopped searching for her. Her captivity was a nightmare no one had anticipated. Kendrick Dillard, the trusted park ranger, had played the role of the perfect public servant, well respected by his peers and admired by the community. No one would have ever suspected him of such horrors. But behind the facade of his professional life, he had been hiding a monster. The horror of Iris's suffering became clear as investigators pieced together the details of her captivity. It was evident that she had been locked in the cellar, her every movement restricted, with only a limited escape to the outside world. There were signs of physical abuse and clear evidence of psychological torment. Her only interaction with the outside world was the occasional visits from Dillard, who kept her in an environment that dehumanized her, reducing her to little more than a prisoner in his twisted game. The question echoed in the minds of everyone involved: how had this happened? How had Iris ended up in Dillard's clutches? Was she taken immediately after Quinn's death, or had she been held captive for days before being moved to the hidden cellar? The timeline was unclear, but the thought that Iris had been alive all these years, that the search had gone on without anyone knowing she was still out there, was more than the families could bear. When the news broke to Lena Petrovich, Iris's mother, the impact was devastating. The truth was worse than any nightmare she had ever imagined. The years of grief, of desperately searching for her daughter, only to find out that she had been alive and trapped in the hands of someone she trusted, tore her apart. For 4 years she had searched in vain, holding on to the hope that her daughter would come home, only to find out that Iris had been suffering right under their noses. The shock of the discovery hit the families like a wave. Iris's survival and the fact that she had been held in captivity completely reshaped the case. It wasn't just about a tragic disappearance anymore, it was about the brutalization of a young woman at the hands of someone who had been a trusted authority figure. The community too was shaken. Dillard had been seen as a pillar of the local law enforcement community. He had been there searching for the girls, helping to lead the charge in the hunt for the missing teens. Now, the very man who had been pretending to help was revealed as the one who had been terrorizing them all along. The discovery of Iris's remains opened a new chapter in the investigation. The search for Quinn's killer and the question of how Iris had been captured would lead investigators into even darker territory. Dillard's involvement in the search effort now seemed like a sickening game, a ploy to throw off suspicion while he continued his monstrous crimes in the shadows. For the families, the grief and pain of knowing that Iris had suffered for years were compounded by the knowledge that Dillard had been right there all along, pretending to help while concealing the truth. The search for justice was now not just about solving the crime but about bringing Dillard and those who helped him to justice for the horrors they had inflicted on two innocent girls. It wasn't just the discovery of Iris's remains that sent shockwaves through the investigation, it was the shocking revelation that the trusted park ranger, Kendrick Dillard, had been behind the unimaginable horrors the girls had endured. After 4 long years of searching, of unanswered questions and cold leads, the truth that no one wanted to face came crashing down. Dillard was the monster hiding in plain sight. The legal battle began in 2018, just after the discovery of Iris's remains in the hidden cellar on Dillard's property. His arrest sent shockwaves through the local community and the entire investigation team. How had they missed him all this time? How had a man who had been actively involved in the search for the missing girls, someone trusted by both his colleagues and the community, been responsible for their abduction and suffering? Dillard's arrest was swift, and as investigators pieced together the mounting evidence, it became clear. Kendrick Dillard was not just the perpetrator, he was the orchestrator of a well-planned scheme to imprison and torture Iris after the brutal murder of Quinn. The arrest was the beginning of a legal journey that would lead to Dillard's trial in 2019. But the trial itself was like a spectacle. Every detail, every horrifying truth was laid bare before the court. For the families, the trial was the painful journey of hearing how their daughters had been subjected to unimaginable suffering at the hands of the man they had trusted to protect them. The evidence against Dillard was overwhelming. Forensic experts confirmed the findings of the arrowhead that had been embedded in Quinn's body, matching it to weapons linked to Dillard's collection. Investigators detailed how Iris had been kept alive in the hidden cellar, tortured, and isolated for years, a nightmare that no one had expected to be true. Each witness, each piece of evidence, added to the portrait of a man who had spent years manipulating those around him, all while hiding his most horrific crime. Lena Petrovich, Iris's mother, sat through every moment of the trial, her grief palpable as the full truth of her daughter's torment was exposed. The emotional toll was indescribable. She had spent 4 years searching for Iris, praying for her safe return, and now she was being forced to confront the reality of what Iris had endured during those years of captivity. The images of Iris's suffering haunted her every waking moment. The truth about what Dillard had done to her daughter was more than she could bear. As the closing arguments were made and the jury deliberated, the families held their breath. Would they finally receive the justice they so desperately needed? In 2019, the verdict came in guilty on all counts. Dillard was convicted of kidnapping, murder, and prolonged abuse. The families, though relieved that the trial was over, now had to deal with the bitter reality that their daughters had been forced to endure years of suffering under Dillard's hands. They'd fought for answers, for justice, and now they had their conviction, but it felt like a hollow victory. For Lena, the pain of knowing that Iris had suffered while the world searched for her was overwhelming. It wasn't just the loss of her daughter. it was the fact that her daughter had been alive all those years, enduring torture while Lena never stopped searching, never stopped hoping. The guilty verdict wasn't the healing they had expected, it was a painful resolution, a final chapter that was too tragic to fully accept. As the judge handed down Dillard's sentence, the question that haunted everyone remained. Why? Why had Dillard, a man sworn to protect the public, chosen to commit such a heinous act? What drove him to target Iris and Quinn? And most chilling of all, was he acting alone? The investigators were convinced that Dillard had been the sole perpetrator, but the darkness of his actions, his calculated manipulation, and his involvement in the search cast a shadow over the case. Had Dillard been part of something larger? Had he been influenced by others, or was he working with someone who had been pulling the strings? Were there other victims, other hidden secrets still buried deep within the Oregon Cascades? As Dillard was led away in handcuffs, those questions loomed large, unanswered. The trial might have ended, but for the families, the questions were far from over. The trial had delivered justice, but it hadn't provided all the answers. The chilling mystery of Dillard's motivations, and whether he had been part of a larger network of people operating in the shadows, still hung in the air. The final truth about Iris and Quinn's fate might have been revealed, but the deeper questions, the ones that lingered in the dark corners of the case, remained. The story wasn't over. Not yet. After 4 long years, the case of Iris Jansen and Quinn Walsh had finally reached its conclusion. Justice had been served. Kendrick Dillard, the man responsible for their suffering, was convicted on all counts, and the truth of what had happened to Iris was finally laid bare for the world to see. Yet for the families, justice brought no healing. Lena Petrovich, Iris's mother, had spent those years clinging to hope. She had searched every corner of the Oregon Cascades, pushed the authorities to investigate every lead, and refused to accept the possibility that her daughter was gone forever. She had faced the unimaginable pain of not knowing, of fearing the worst every day, of hoping for a miracle that never came. But nothing could have prepared her for the truth. When the discovery of Iris's remains came to light, buried in the hidden cellar on Dillard's property, it shattered everything. The fact that Iris had been alive, locked away in captivity, for 4 years suffering in silence, enduring unimaginable torture, was more than Lena could bear. The realization that her daughter had been so close yet so far away, that all those years of searching were in vain, was a wound that would never heal. The grief of learning about Iris's captivity haunted Lena long after the trial. Justice was served, but it came at a price. The mother's relentless pursuit of answers had ultimately revealed a truth that was far darker than she could have ever imagined. Lena had to live with the knowledge that her daughter had been alone and suffering when she thought she was doing everything she could to bring her home. But Lena wasn't the only one affected. The entire community, once so proud of their trusted park ranger Kendrick Dillard, now had to face the uncomfortable truth. The man they had trusted, the man who had helped in the search for the missing girls, was responsible for their deaths. The shock of his arrest and conviction reverberated throughout the town, leaving a sense of betrayal and disbelief that would never fully fade. For the families, justice had come at the expense of their peace of mind. Quinn's family, who had also spent years living in a state of constant fear, now had to reconcile the fact that their daughter had not simply disappeared, but had been murdered in a violent and callous way. The emotional toll of hearing the full details of their daughter's suffering in court was devastating. They too were left to process the crushing truth that their children's final days had been marked by abuse, fear, and pain, a pain they could never truly escape. But there was more to this story than just the grief of the families. It was a chilling lesson about the darkness that can hide beneath the surface of even the most beautiful places. The Oregon Cascades, known for their majestic beauty and tranquil wilderness, were now tainted. Once a place of wonder and peace, they had become the backdrop for an unimaginable tragedy. It served as a stark reminder that even the most serene and seemingly safe places could conceal danger lurking beneath the surface, unnoticed until it's too late. The case of Iris and Quinn was no longer just about two missing teens. It had become a chilling reminder of the hidden dangers that can exist in the most innocent-seeming places. The wilderness, which many see as a place of freedom and peace, had turned into a trap, a place of horror for two young girls who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the investigation closed and the final verdicts were handed down, the families were left with an endless void. Justice had been served, but at what cost? They had lost their daughters, their peace, and in many ways, their trust in the world they had once known. And still, the haunting questions lingered. How had Dillard managed to keep his secret for so long? What drove him to commit such horrific acts? Was he acting alone, or was there something more behind the darkness that had unfolded in the wilderness? Was the Oregon Cascades just the tip of the iceberg, a place where hidden evil had been allowed to thrive? As the families grappled with their grief, they were left with the painful realization that answers would never truly be enough. Even with justice served, the damage had been done. The Oregon Cascades would forever carry the weight of that darkness, a darkness that would never fully dissipate, no matter how much time passed. Thank you for joining us on this heartbreaking journey. The case of Iris Jansen and Quinn Walsh has left us with more questions than answers, but their story deserves to be remembered. If you found their story moving and want to continue following true crime cases like this, please make sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support means everything to us, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think really happened in the Oregon Cascades? Leave a comment below and share your theories, or simply let us know where you're watching from. And if you've been with us till the end, thank you for caring about the victims and their families. Together we can keep their stories alive.